Psalm 131 is one of the 15 songs of ascent, which are made up of Psalms 120 through 134. These are songs that the people of God likely sang during their annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And this psalm in particular is a wonderful little prayer. Erhard Gerstenberger calls it a jewel of simplicity in his commentary of the Psalms. It's composed of 3 verses, 3 poetic stanzas, and it's very easy to memorize, which I suggest that you take time to do. And here's what the psalmist says: "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord, from this time forth and forevermore." This is a pretty remarkable metaphor, likening God to the mother of a weaned child, given that Jesus reveals God to us as Father. Now, I do not think that metaphors give license to change what has been revealed. God has been revealed as Father. Mother is just a metaphor for God, so I don't think it is theologically orthodox to call God Mother. Nevertheless, it is passages such as this that we must pay attention to, for they describe God in maternal terms, and in so doing ascribe enormous dignity to motherhood. So now motherhood, just like we often say about fatherhood, at its very best is an earthly symbol of God's love and nurturing care. I suppose all of this is my way of offering a very belated Happy Mother's Day. Now, when I hear this psalm, I am reminded of question 1 in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which says, "What is the chief end of man?" And the answer is, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. For all I know about motherhood and babies, which is next to nothing on both counts, it does seem to me that there is a difference between the way a breastfeeding child relates to its mother and the way a weaned child relates to its mother. The breastfeeding child is entirely dependent on its mother for care and nourishment. Very truly, the child is helpless without her. So the child's needs are front and center in its nervous system, and it often makes those needs known by screaming and crying. Of course it does. It's the only way the child knows how to communicate. So good mothers respond to those cries, taking up the child in their arms and satisfying their appetites, then giving them a burp and putting them back to rest until it's time to do it all over again. And I think life in Christ happens in much the same way. God in His mercy satisfies our ongoing cries for forgiveness and for salvation in the death and resurrection of His Son. And so in Christ we are swept into the loving embrace of God, who rescues us from our helplessness. But children have to be weaned, just as the psalm says. And the Hebrew word here for weaned, gamel, suggests, this is from Nancy DeClays Walford's commentary of the Psalms, a child who no longer cries out in hunger for the mother's breast, but who seeks out the mother for her warm embrace and nurturing care. In other words, the weaned child has a deepened relationship with its mother and has learned to enjoy its mother for who she is, not just what she offers. God likewise redeems us from sin and helplessness so that we may in turn have a relationship with Him. He attends to our persistent needs in the beginning of our life in Christ, but always intends that we transition from milk to solid food, just as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, so that we may grow in our trust and in our delight in Him. This is not to suggest that we ever stop depending on God. We most certainly do not, just like the weaned child does not no longer depend on its mother, but the shape of that dependence has evolved. We are no longer like, as Arthur Weiser writes in his book on the Psalms, an infant crying loudly for his mother's breast, but like a weaned child that quietly rests by his mother's side, happy in being with her. No desire now comes between him and his God, for he is sure that God knows what he needs before he asks him. And just as the child gradually breaks off the habit of regarding his mother only as a means of satisfying his own desires, and learns to love her for her own sake, so the worshiper, after a struggle, has reached an attitude of mind in which he desires God for himself, and not as a means of fulfillment of his own wishes. His life's center of gravity has shifted. He now rests no longer in himself, but in God.